Hey everyone, it's Eugene here, and welcome back to another Forensics Talks. This is episode 89, and yeah, we've had a little bit of a summer break. We're all back here, and I think September is sort of like the getting close to the end of the summer. It's not officially, but everybody's back at work, and I'm eager to get back to it. So I'm really happy with our guest today, who is Robert Wyman. And just before we begin, I'm just going to make a couple of quick things here. First off, I know I can already see people in the chat window. You guys are like way ahead of me, so thank you very much. Let us know where you're from. We always like to know where people are watching from, and especially when you're from out of the country, around the world, whatever. Thank you very much for joining us. If you have any questions or comments during the interview or whatever, go ahead and place them inside of the chat window. I will look them over, and I'll try to make sure that we pose some of those questions as best as possible to our guest. One thing I was going to point out today, and that is that there is some training coming up. So Recon 3D, I did a a little webinar thing on Tuesday, and we had a really great turnout. So thank you to all the people who were there. I really appreciate your time. Worked out really well. There was some great feedback. And for those of you who are Recon 3D users, or if you're looking to get into Recon 3D, which is the iPhone scanning app, we're having our class on September 19th. So this is a short class. It's an afternoon. It's 4 hours. One of the biggest questions is whether or not it's recorded. Yes, it's recorded. So I do instruct live, but the class remains recorded for a period of 2 weeks so that people can catch up later on. I know everybody's busy. There's work, there's trials, depositions, there's all kinds of stuff going on. And of course, if you're in a terrible time zone, I wouldn't want you to be up at 2 in the morning. But you can do everything based on the recording. If you finish everything, there's a certificate. Also, for those of you who are crash or collision investigators and you have the ACTAR accreditation, there are CEUs for that as well. Okay, so if you are interested, let me go back here. Yeah, you can just go to www.recon-3d.com, go to the training page, and you'll be able to see it. Okay, let's get right to it. I don't want to waste any more time. Let me get to the next speaker. So the guest today is Robert Wyman, and Robert is the president of Wyman Enterprises, Inc., and he's located in Sunrise, Florida. It's an appropriate name. His main focus is on forensic photography and evidence documentation services, but he works both on the civil and criminal side, and he offers actually a really wide range of services, whether it's for injury and scar documentation. He works with cell phone localization. He does work with site mapping and documentation, timing analysis, traffic signal stuff, code compliance. So he has a very large bag of tricks. Let's call it up his sleeve. He's been doing this for some time. Now, I first met Robert. It was actually on the phone. So we've had some really great phone calls, but for a long time we never met face to face. And so I most recently saw him at the IAI that was in Maryland, which was great to see him. Saw him at Rex conference, which was in Florida as well. And he was also a speaker along with a colleague of his, Larry Stringham, at the Forensic Photography Symposium. And it was there that they first started presenting about using phones and apps for crash and crime scenes. And so that sort of got me thinking about sort of some of my prejudice against using mobile phones and things like that. And I thought it was a pretty interesting presentation, and that's why he's going to be here today. So let me bring him on in. There he is. Hey, Robert, how you doing?
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me.
Hey, great. Well, I've always appreciated our long phone conversations that seem to keep going and going. But I mean, you're a very how can I say, you're intense. You're passionate about what you do and stuff. So yeah, I've always appreciated our conversations.
Thank you.
So let's talk about. Let's go back actually. Let's talk about before what you were doing now. What got you into this area? Were you a photographer before? Were you doing something different? Like how did you fall into this?
Try to be brief here. We're talking about a lot of history. Um, I did not get into photography until I started working for the Miami-Dade County Department of Traffic and Transportation. I started as an engineering aide part-time right after high school, actually. And this was in the film camera days. And they used photography to document hazardous locations and traffic problems and things like that. Since I was the new kid on the block and the junior kid on the block, they sent me out into the heat and the mosquitoes and the rain and everything else with the camera, so they didn't have to do it. But that's how I was introduced to this, and it blossomed from there. I was never into like yearbook in high school or any other photography type of thing. So it started at that point, and eventually I stopped using the county's camera, which was some old relic Pentax, maybe SRT 101 or something for those who remember those days. And I bought my own camera, which was a Nikon, and just went forward from there through the years with all different brands, all different technologies, and to the point where we're at today.
Okay. Now, so back then, did you have to develop your own film? Did the what kinds of resources did the police agency have?
It was the traffic department actually, and they had a contract with a local lab. So all I had to do was take film out of a cabinet, county purchased film, do my thing, turn it into a supervisor. Eventually, it got over to the photo lab. They developed it. A week or so later, I'd get 4x6 prints back and put them in the file and move on to the next one.
Like when I look at all the stuff you're doing, I mean, obviously, at some point you decided to go out on your own and do all these things, but there's like, I mean, I look at the list of things, there's a ton of things that you're interested in. And it seems like you've always been interested in like devices and technology. Like you seem like a tech kind of guy. So how can you describe sort of the path from photography to like some of these other things that you were interested in?
Sure. And I'm just waiting for somebody to type in, somebody who knows me to type in on the right hand side of my screen here, Inspector Gadget, because I have been called that many times with the little devices that I've purchased over the years. But yeah, photography is where it all started. And the evolution or the progression was such that the next thing that caught my eye was GPS. GPS devices came out, or let me just say consumer GPS devices came out in the late 90s. And they were very large, very heavy. They were called portable, but they were far from really portable. And they were made for the marine industry. The little Garmin hiking GPSs and things like that were years away. But I was able to obtain one of those. And I thought this would be really cool in the traffic engineering world, not so much for a coordination with photography, that came a little later, but for doing some studies, traffic studies. And one of those was called a travel time study, where we actually drive a route to see what the real world delays are with traffic congestion and traffic signals and things like that. So I used that device for that, and I was sold. I mean, when Garmin's came out, I was purchasing those, and all different models, and more recently the survey quality GPSs from Trimble and others. So it's just continued. But the device side of it was photography to GPS, and then the GPS augmented the photography by allowing me to produce exhibits to show where I was taking the pictures. I would be able to record latitude and longitude and make maps to show where I was. So that was a big leap. Other things that I get into, like audio, video, forensics, and things like that, were just interests, and I was asked to do them. One of those things, hey, can you do this? And I was thinking, I might be able to do that. And again, we're going back many years, so there were no training courses. Everything was seat of your pants, self-taught. If you became proficient, great. If you didn't, you moved on to something else. Now, of course, you can take courses and everything.
Yeah, for sure. So what about like little technologies and things like that? We're obviously going to be talking about these mobile devices, and so I'm wondering about early on the adoption of things like, do you remember the Palm Pilot, like the Palm Pilot and things like that? Like, were any of those things like items that you might have used in your work?
All of them. I spent way too much money on all of those things. The Palm Pilots, there was a company called Sharp. I don't know if Sharp is around anymore, but they had these little pocket organizer things. Sony had some stuff. There were a few others I don't remember, but yeah, I embraced all of that. I used to carry around one of those planner books, one of those three-ring binder planner books. That was my daily companion for the calendar, for the contact list, for notes, for everything. It never left my side. But when these electronic organizers came out, it was like, wait a second, I can put hundreds of phone numbers in here and search them instantly. I could put all my calendar stuff in here and filter them, color code them, search them. Everything that I was doing in the 3-ring binder could be done in this little electronic device. And I loved that. I just thought that was incredibly efficient. And as that technology blossomed with the different devices and manufacturers, I just kept spending money and kept moving on and buying new stuff.
Yeah. With respect to the adoption of new technology, I mean, you mentioned film, and I remember I was a kid, and I remember taking a summer school course in photography and developing film and going out with the film cameras and everything. Um, but for me, the transition to digital was really, my eyes just lit up on fire when I could afford it. And I remember exactly where I was. Actually, I was in Buffalo, New York. I was at a grocery store, and they had a section, like a separate counter or whatever, with electronics. And I remember seeing this Olympus digital camera with the really big flash drives, like those little big
Mhm.
cards or whatever. And I remember buying that. And for me, the idea, moving from film to digital, wasn't a big leap. I mean, I had seen some of it, and I thought this is incredible. Even though the original digital cameras weren't that great in comparison to today. I mean, you just can't
Right.
compare. But do you remember a time, or was there any resistance from going from film to digital initially with policing?
Resistance in bold letters with the capitals and flashing lights behind it. Yes. Uh, to the point where some agencies would say back then, we will never go to digital. We will always have negatives because negatives are what's in our file as evidence of what we did or documentation of what we did on a scene. We'll never go to digital. That technology is never going to catch on, and it's never going to be as good as film, on and on and on. So I had heard that before because I'm old enough to have gone through some of these evolutions. And the previous time when that issue came up was when videotape came out. Prior to videotape, VHS and beta, uh, police agencies and news organizations used film cameras, motion picture cameras, like 16 millimeter old, big old things you put on your shoulder. And all of a sudden, videotape came out, and there was a great resistance to using that in the public safety sector because you literally, this was the argument, you could not hold up a strip of videotape to the light and see your images as you could with the 16 millimeter film cameras. So the argument was, we don't know if this was edited. We don't know if this was cut because editing film back then, you literally cut the film, did splices, did whatever you did. Uh, you couldn't do that in the same way with video. So there was resistance that we don't know what's on this tape unless we play it, and we don't know if it's we don't know the sanctity of the recording. We don't know if it's been altered or not. So of course it took several years for it to catch on, and eventually it did. And now you don't see anybody with old motion picture cameras roaming around. And you don't even see people with VHS and beta cameras, videotape cameras running around. So yeah, the resistance in the public safety sector is real. It happens every time there's a technology leap. It usually takes, I'd say, 3 to 5 years before everybody gets on board, and they throw up a bunch of excuses at the beginning of why we shouldn't do it. But by the end, it's like, why did we make such a big deal about this? But it happens every time.
Do you remember when you had your first, let's say, smart mobile device or smartphone or whatever? When was that for you, and when did you have the realization that, hey, you could use this for other things at work?
There was, I'm trying to remember the brand. It might have been Nokia or one of the older brands, it may have even been a Motorola. Um, they came out with a phone that had accessories, and the accessories plugged into the power port at the bottom of the phone or the side of the phone or whatever. I don't remember which brand it was, but it had a camera. And this was a novelty back then. This was like, wait a second, a phone and a camera? Why would anybody want to combine those two? There was just no thought to that. There was no consumer research that said, oh, yeah, everybody wants to have a phone in their pocket. It was unheard of. Nobody carried around cameras unless you were a photographer or had some reason to. So the phone came out with this little add on camera, and it was VGA, as I recall, like 640 by 480, if I'm getting my numbers right. very low resolution, but it was a novelty item. It was like, look what I can do with my phone. I could take a picture, and that picture shows up on the phone screen. So for me, that was like, okay, this might be the future. It's not good enough for prime time. It's not ready for prime time right now, but I think it's foretelling what's going to come down the pike if technology marches on. So I remember that one, but I didn't really start embracing the smartphone thing until I got an iPhone. And then, of course, you had everything built in, cameras and audio and apps and everything else was all integrated. And we had never had that before.
When did you get your first iPhone?
I was trying to think. I think the iPhone 3 or like a 3G or a 3 something. I think that was my first one. I don't remember the year. I'm guessing mid 2000s, whenever that came out. But
Yeah,
I think
maybe.
it was that 3 model, which was my very first one.
Yeah. So, I mean, along the way, obviously, there's been a lot of apps and things like that, which, are made for the iPhone, and there's been other things that they've jammed in terms of sensors and things. So,
Mhm.
like, when did you start saying, "Hey, I can use a whole bunch of these apps to do work"? Like, you started even trying to convince other people or doing presentations and saying, "Hey, folks, like, there's all these tools and these phones that are apps that you can use, and they're very useful." So was that like later, like 2012 or around that time? And what were these apps that you were using at that time?
Mhm. I don't remember the year, but certainly there was a progression. Shortly after I got the iPhone, I was bombarded, I think everybody was, with emails and advertisements from Apple to go to the App Store and look at stuff. And of course, they were selling products on the App Store, so that was their motivation. But I would go there and do keyword searches. And I was astounded at the number of apps that were being written by developers that could be put into service in many different industries. I started with photography apps and then moved on and did keyword searches for other things. And eventually I would do keyword searches for like the word forensics or trajectory or blood spatter or whatever it was. Um, 99% of the stuff that I'd get back from the App Store as far as the list of items were games. People were writing games more than anything else. So I'd have to filter through all the games that had a keyword of forensics or something. Um, and find the little gems that were in there. And some of those gems were written by programmers who are also CSIs or engineers. And they were trying to establish the fact that the phone could be used for something. So I purchased some of them. I downloaded the free ones. I started using them. And lo and behold, there were quite a few that had a place, at least in my practice. I was private at that point. So I didn't have to worry about government approval or IT department approvals or things like that. I had the freedom downloading something, using it, deciding if I wanted it or not, deleting it if I wanted it, etc. But yeah, there were a lot of apps. Most of them are gone now. The developers haven't kept up with it, but there's still some core ones there that are very useful, I think, in crash recon and crime scene investigation and recon.
Let's talk about photography for a second, because I think that's one that is most familiar with everybody and sort of most apparent because everybody uses their mobile phones now for photography with family and video, and these things are jam packed. So there's been a lot of developments in terms of the sensor size and the quality of the lenses and things like that. But can you say something about the level of control and the way that the photos are created inside of the app? Because yeah, like sometimes, in just my experience, sometimes I just take a photo with my phone and it comes out exactly as I want. Whereas I get the digital camera, the white balance is off, or you know what I
Mhm.
mean, something different. I got to mess with it a little bit more. It's not to say that I can't get what I need. It just sometimes take a little bit more work. But it just seems like sometimes you just get what you want with the iPhone. And just wondering if you
Right.
have any comments about that.
Sure. There's an old saying that the best camera to have, the best camera out there is the camera you have with you. That's an old saying, even from the film days, when people would compare Nikon and Canon and Olympus and later on Minolta and Sony and the rest of them. What's the best camera out there? The one you have with you. Um, that has been embraced, it seems, by the programmers of the smartphones because they have developed systems, and the miniaturization just blows me away that they can put all this stuff in such a small area because we're all used to holding a camera in our hands, a DSLR or something large. And yet all of this is being miniaturized. And their programming is such where, however they've done it, they've nailed what we used to call, or still call, the exposure triangle, that balance of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, the sensitivity, of the camera. They've nailed it. And yeah, you can usually get a very good picture first time out without a lot of trial and error, just pulling that phone out of your pocket and taking the picture that you want. It absolutely is amazing. And that's why I think that tool is so valuable. It's just not a novelty anymore like it started out 20 some odd years ago.
I want to play a little clip from Larry Stringham, who was your co-presenter at the Forensic Photography Symposium. And he was, I guess, the forensic supervisor at the Cape Coral Police Department, since retired. So I believe he's enjoying his retirement. But before I play this, could you just explain, like, you met him and you guys had some common interests?
I had been... I evolved my list of apps that were useful for traffic crash recon, and that's where I started. It was all traffic crash oriented. So I had been publishing a list first for myself, and then I made other colleagues aware of it, so I would be sending them out. Eventually, that evolved to doing seminars and conferences, presenting what I called my apps list, and showing examples of what you could do with a phone for traffic crash recon. Everything from the photography, the video, mapping, aerial photos, calculations, everything. So I also am integrated with the crime scene investigation world, in addition to the traffic crash reconstruction world, and I attend those conventions as well. Lo and behold, on the agenda list one year was Larry Stringham, and he was doing an apps presentation oriented toward crime scene investigation. So of course I had to see that. And we actually had a lot of commonality in the apps that we had chosen, but he had some specialty ones that he had found for crime scene recon. I had mine that I had found for crash recon. So basically, after that seminar, went up, shook his hand, said, "We need to talk." And that evolved into a series of dual or co-presentations that we did for local and national IAI conferences around the country, showing off the apps and showing what could be done. Even back then, we're now talking probably maybe 8 years ago, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. So yeah, he noticed the same thing as far as the usefulness of the smartphones in the crime scene world. So it was a parallel course, and I found that really interesting and very enjoyable to work with him.
Well, let me play the video clip, and then he mentioned something in the clip that I'm going to ask you about after. So let's go ahead and do this. It's only a couple minutes, and then we'll be right back. Hold on.
Well, I'd like to talk about 2016. That's the last time that I used a DSLR or SLR on the scene. I only used iPhones from 2016 till I retired. I was a supervisor, and all my employees still had the DSLR and the SLR ready and available for them, but they were able to use their iPhones or their Androids as well, but they chose not to. They always used their cameras. I got to one particular scene, though, deep in the woods, and in the Cape, that's very difficult to find, but we found the one area that had deep in the woods, and you weren't able to carry material back. You had to walk back there. And if you've ever worked in the scenes in deep in the woods, which when I worked for Hernando County, you'd carrying bucket loads of things with you and different types of handles and situations like that can be rather cumbersome. I decided just to bring my phone with me. And I was able to get my azimuth reading. I was able to get my GPS. I was able to get all the photographs, videos, panoramic views. I was able to use a couple different apps to do measuring. And I did everything from my iPhone. And it's at that time that I found out that the cell phone was available and ready to go, and it was usable. And that's when the decision for me was to go all with iPhone as much as possible. But before I did that, I actually went to the state attorney's office and asked them the admissibility. And they looked at me and they said, "How many times has your phone ever been, not your phone, but your camera ever been subpoenaed for download?" And I go, "Never." He goes like, "Well, what would be the difference if you have a well-written SOP, a well-written general order about downloading? There should be no issue." And to be truthful, I got asked on the stand once, and that was it.
Yeah, so the magic question there had to do with the subpoena thing, and I've heard this
Right.
before too. Like I heard people saying, "Hey, don't use your personal phone because they're going to rip the phone out of your hands and they're going to put it into evidence or something like that." And so, did you hear a lot of the same arguments early on, and what have you found with respect to really using your phone for for crime scenes or crash scenes?
Uh, that thought was prevalent early on. It is still out there today in some agencies. There are some agencies out there, state attorney's offices or district attorney's offices, as well as the actual law enforcement agency policies and procedures that refuse to acknowledge the availability and the um, just the excellence of imaging and other documentation efforts that you can do with a phone. With that said, other agencies slowly have been embracing them. Some of them have their own rules. You can only use an agency issued phone, not a personal phone. Some of them will have very strict download requirements, which are really the same as the DSLR. Almost every agency has some type of policy of when the images are downloaded from a camera and put into some type of evidence locker or uh, onto a secure server or whatever the procedure is. Usually a CSI has to do that. I'll just say shortly after their shift, shortly after they take the pictures. They're not going to wait 6 weeks to download some images. It's going to be relatively soon, within hours or days. And those types of policies also fit for Android or iPhone camera use. If you download everything in a proper amount of time, following procedures, then there should be no problem. In terms of have I ever heard of anybody having their phones looked at? Never. Across the entire country, I've heard the argument we can't use our phones because somebody will, a defense attorney will take our phones. Obviously, if it's a criminal case. On a civil side, not so much worry about that, but excuse me, it still comes out. So I have not heard of anybody having to surrender their phones at any time for any type of inspection. And what I tell people these days, especially when I'm teaching a course or something, is if that question comes up, repeat exactly what Larry Stringham said. How many times has your DSLR been demanded to be produced so that it can be inspected? Now, when I say that in a class, and perhaps with this audience too, people say, no, nobody's ever looked at our DSLRs. Nobody has ever, and I'll broaden it out. For those of you who use audio recording devices, digital voice recorders, how many times has the recorder been demanded to be presented for an inspection? And the answer is never. And that's the answer I'd like to see the state attorneys and district attorneys use as well. If there is a defense attorney who demands to see a phone, there should be a counter to that. It shouldn't be, oh yeah, here's the phone. It's like, why do you need the phone? The phone is a tool, and the phone records images. In this, we're talking photography, just like the DSLR does. So we will provide you with the images because that is what our output is. You do not need to see the tool, and anything else on that tool is irrelevant to this case. So there does have to be a strong pushback in case something comes in like that. But I am seeing in the comments here that some people have had to give up their phones. It's a surprise to me. I've never heard of that before. But again, I think a strong pushback is the proper answer. There's no reason to show off the hardware. The hardware is just that, hardware. It's the images, which is your output, and the result of your photographic effort. I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, Neil had posted that, he's had some phones taken, and I would love to know what happened there, Neil. So if you're listening, go ahead and maybe give us a little summary in the comments here. It'd be interesting to understand what happened. But definitely it's not something that's common that I've heard of. But let me ask you this, though. I mean, you've probably seen a large uptake in people using their mobile phones, for example, at vehicle inspections and things like this, especially on the private side, no?
Correct. On the private side, especially, but also because of the quality, especially on the video. Everybody's still walking around with cameras, but on the video side, I'm seeing almost, 80% or more use of the phone for video because the video quality is so amazing. And nobody's walking around with camcorders anymore or anything like that. The only people that I know that are still embracing the camcorder style use are the private investigators who are doing surveillance. And they will be using those in surveillance environments because they'll have large zoom lenses and low light capabilities and things like that, which are suitable for surveillance. But as far as up close daytime or even evening crash investigation, vehicle inspection, site inspection, I'm seeing almost 100%, like say 80% or more phone use for the video side.
You had mentioned to me one time that you use like GPS. You do a lot of stuff with GPS, and also for like your photography. So are you using any apps for obtaining GPS information along with your phone, or something with the phone and the camera together?
Yes. When I'm not using the phone as the photographic device and I'm using my camera, I transitioned to Sony many years ago when Sony bought out Minolta. For those of you who remember Minolta, Sony bought out Minolta at the end of the film days, and Sony transitioned everything to their product, which was from the beginning, a digital product. So I had Minolta lenses. I had Minolta cameras back then. So I went right over to Sony because I could use the same lenses, and I've been with them ever since. Now, I'm saying that because the Sony cameras, and perhaps the newer Nikons and Canons and others, I'm just not sure, but the Sony cameras do have an app where the camera body will talk to the phone via Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, or a combination. And the phone is recording the GPS as long as your location services are on. I mean, that's constant. So the camera, the Sony app extracts that information, sends it to the camera body, and embeds it into the metadata, into the EXIF data of the image. So when I download those images, I have latitude and longitude right there with every image. And I use that quite a bit because a lot of times I'll do multiple assignments in a day. And they might be widely spaced out, different times, different environments. I generally do know where I'm at in the world as far as where the assignments are, but it's also very nice to produce a map and say, here's where all the pictures were taken. Here's this assignment, here's that assignment. Or if one assignment has multiple locations, I might look at a scene, a crash site at an intersection, and then go to an insurance holding yard to look at the vehicle, and then go somewhere else to look at some other vehicle. I can produce a map that shows all of these locations, the dates, the times, the duration of time I was there. So it answers a lot of questions when it comes to testimony down the road of what I did and how I did it.
So do you take the GPS data and like, do you put it into like over a Google Maps thing, or do you take a map and you just start locating it that way?
I download the information either through, generally, I have different ones. I've got Garmin apps. I've got an online system called GPS Visualizer, which is a free website. There are a few GPS devices out there. There's another one that's a Windows-based only called GPS Utility. And all of these will take latitudes and longitudes and translate them into other formats. So I download the latitude and longitude usually through a metadata reader. So that's the first step. That'll get those latitudes and longitudes off of the list of images. Those then go into Excel. I could change the labels. I could name them, do whatever I want with them in Excel. And then from Excel, it will go into one of those GPS programs. And the output that I select from the GPS program is Google Earth. So what I get out of the GPS program is a KML image, a KML file. That goes into Google Earth, and now everything's automatically plotted. I have an instant exhibit to show where everything was. I could color code it. I could change the icons. I could add labels and produce a finished exhibit within just a few minutes and then move on to the next one. So it's, for me, a very, there's multiple steps, but it's still very easy. And my end result is something that's ready for court, right then and there, ready for a deposition, ready for testimony.
Yeah, I had a colleague, an old friend of mine, I would say a colleague, friend, Zig Gorski up here in Canada, and he would use the phone, like the accelerometer apps. And so he would actually mount it on vehicles and he'd drive vehicles through, and you could see the X, Y, and Z plots of acceleration. I thought it was super cool. And he did a great job, and he would accompany that with camera footage and stuff and video. So I thought that was really, really neat. Are there any apps that you're using not so much for photography, but for also for like mapping, other mapping purposes?
I highly recommend Theodolite, and Theodolite is a surveying app. It has been recommended by one of the surveying associations as being an accurate thing. I don't remember the exact name of the association, but it does have some type of association blessing that a licensed surveyor can actually use this app. It's not going to replace the larger, laser scanners, total stations, optical instruments, but it does provide quite a bit of great information along with photo or video. GPS, GPS, your compass direction, azimuth, altitude, the attitude of the phone, meaning like pan, tilt, and roll. Your axis measurements are all there. So I have used that quite a bit on some of my assignments, and we could go into examples if you want. But that's a really good one. Microsoft Office is out there now. You could do an entire Microsoft Office right on your phone or tablet. That's extremely useful. And just to go backwards for a second, you had mentioned the accelerometer apps. I did do some tests with those at some of the crash conferences, and they were good. I mean, what we found was the commercial accelerometer devices. I think one of them is Race Logic, and there might be a few others out there. They had a very a higher sampling rate. So it was more useful to the crash reconstructionists to have a very high sampling rate. I mean, hundreds of points per second instead of the lower sampling rate and limited memory that was in the phones. But it still worked. When we plotted the graphs, they were parallel. They were the same as the larger instruments. But for the crash recon world and the calculations that are done, the reconstructionists were drawn more to the products that were made for that purpose.
Let me ask you about theodolite. I'm not familiar with it. So how does it work? Like, are you like sitting in a position, or taking photographs with it and picking a point? How does it work?
You bring it up on your screen, and it immediately has an overlay, like a heads-up display for the pilots that are out there who may know what that is. It's just like a clear overlay, and it gives you all of your geodetic data right there on the screen. So as you're moving the phone around, as you're holding it up, it will tell you all your angular measurements, your tilt, your roll, everything. It'll give you your GPS. It'll give you time of day. It'll allow you to do a screenshot or photos and videos with that overlay either on it or removed from it. You could do some rudimentary measurements with it as like a rangefinder. And I'll go ahead and give an example just to show you. If, let's just say, a vehicle went into a canal or a lake, and you have a embankment, and that embankment has an angle from the main level of the land down the lake shore or canal shore edge down to the water line. If you wanted to measure what that angle was, you would literally just stand at the top of the embankment and angle your phone down to match the angle of the embankment. I mean, you're looking at it, you could see what the angle is, and then read that angular measurement right off of the phone. So that plus the GPS, plus the azimuth, your compass direction, it's a really good tool, and it's instantly available. There's a initial purchase fee, but there's no usage fee, and it's always there, ready to go. So that's a very useful one that I really highly recommend.
That's awesome. I'm going to look into that. I didn't know about this. I've seen some other like measuring apps, like where you can do some simple things, but I didn't know about that one. So yeah, that's a good tip. So I thank you for that. What about the phone and how it integrates with other devices? Because like I have for example, like a GoPro, and you use the phone to view, and it'll record and send all that information. So the phone, even if it doesn't have a built-in whatever it is, a sensor or whatever it is, it sort of externally controls other devices too. So have you used the phone like ever to control your camera or like to do other things like that?
Yes, and highly recommended also, both in the crash scene world, crash reconstruction world, and the crime scene world. One of the best uses of that remote control feature, where you're using your phone as a viewfinder and as a shutter release for your camera. There's obviously the wireless connection between the phone and the camera. if you had a confined space environment, you're looking up under a seat, under a dashboard, in a wheel well, in an engine compartment, underneath the car for the crash people, or any kind of confined space environment for the crime scene people, in a cabinet, under a table, behind a wall cabinet, something like that, a shelving unit. You could position the camera in a way to get that image, but you couldn't position your face next to the camera to be able to see what you're looking at in a viewfinder or at a screen. The phone, as a remote control, can now be comfortably held, even by a second person, and you can get that confined space image perfectly without contorting yourself to get into that small or low or tight area. So yeah, I've used it as a remote control for those types of things. It's very, very useful.
Interesting. I just see Jay here saying that EXIF tool by Phil Harvey is another useful app that will pull the GPS off of geotagged photos. Yeah, it geotags, and that's super super useful stuff. I was going to ask you, and I just lost my thought here. Let me get to my notes here for a second, because I had a question for you regarding the a comment that you said with the fact that there seems to be like a diminishing number of apps now. Like before, there may have been more that used, and maybe not so many now. And is there a reason for that, or?
I could just guess that with all the iOS changes and whatever specifications that Apple has or Google has, whatever in the Android world, Samsung or whomever, that the app developers are just not able to put in as much time as needed to keep up with everything, to keep up with all the development kits, maybe to pay whatever fees are needed for those development kits, and all that in relation to their sales. So yeah, there used to be photogrammetry apps. There used to be some very interesting measuring and documentation apps that were out there for the iPhone that are no longer available. Things that would do overlays to like walls. It would put a grid pattern up on a wall, which might be good for trajectory analysis or blood spatter. And you could take that picture. So you could just look at a wall and bring up the app, and a grid pattern would be displayed, and you could fine tune the grid pattern to the proper dimensions of the wall, take that picture, and now you had an image with a grid pattern, and you could use that for further analysis. So a lot of at least the original ones that I had are no longer there. I haven't done a search for those recently, but those app developers unfortunately went away. Now what we have are these core ones, as I mentioned, like Microsoft Office and some of the other ones, and things like Theodolite that have been around now for over a decade. And that's what's out there. So there were quite a few specialty items. Another one, just remembered, was written by a crime scene investigator, and it was an evidence marker app. It actually turned your phone into a black numbers on a yellow background evidence marker. Everybody that's in that world is probably thinking to themselves now, yeah, but if my phone is the evidence marker, I don't want to put my phone into that scene and contaminate the scene and everything else. There were, sometimes when I used it, mostly outdoors, like the beginning of a skid mark or something like that, where there was no contamination issue. I was just a marker issue, an indexing issue. So you could select the alphanumeric display on your phone. You could select the colors, and basically your phone screen was one of those evidence markers, just like the tents you have on the shelf behind you, that kind of thing, just on the phone. So there have been a few that are out there. Some have gone away. Some have been more novelties than anything else, but it's been interesting to see the developments.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. And folks, if any of you have any comments or any favorite apps, go ahead and drop it into the comments. Always interesting to hear what other people are using. And I think, look, there's some companies that are obviously taking this very seriously in terms of, having these mobile devices. And actually, I can see Jeff Gerbis is on here. And just on the, webinar that I did on Tuesday, I mentioned CrimePad, which is working on a tablet. And the fact that you're using it for case management, you're using it for photographs, and you can do the things like sketches too. So you want to do like a quick diagram of your scene, like so you could use. I'm sure there's with Office, I think there's like an app where you can draw some things. I think I can't remember what it's called. Even just the the little notepad thing.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, you can do some drawing in there as well, and even Axon. So Axon is. They have their capture app, and they're using it for interviews, for audio, for the video photography, and it integrates with some of their other devices, from what I understand. So, and it takes all that data and it uploads it to evidence.com. So,
Right.
yeah.
And that's, let me just jump in. That's a big part of it. Prior to secure servers and subscription services coming on board, that was a real worry as to what do we do with all these images? What do we do with these videos? What do we do with the audio recordings? How do we organize them? So CrimePad and some of the other ones, some of those have come and gone as well, give you a one-stop shop. And they allow all of this stuff to be recorded in a single place and securely archived, which was a big worry at the beginning as to what is going to happen and who's going to see it, who has access to it, what kind of passwords, all that kind of stuff. So we're evolving and we're finding solutions to these problems that seemed insurmountable even just a few years ago.
So what would you say are some of the limitations, though? Like, if somebody's, saying, well, I'll just use my phone or whatever. I mean, what are some of the limitations of using the phone, versus like a nice, new mirrorless camera or something like that? Where is it useful and where is it not useful today?
One of my catchphrases that I like to use is, it's a tool, not a toy. So like all tools, you should be familiar with it and competent with it. For the people who just take that phone out of their pocket or their briefcase and just start, everything on as is, as you bring the camera app up, you just start snapping pictures. You're probably not using the full capabilities of that device. Now, if you're outside in a bright sunny day, you're going to get a great picture. But if you're in a low light situation, a situation with limited contrast, sometimes different colors don't reproduce well, you should practice with your phone and even take courses that are out there now on phone photography to learn how to adjust exposures, how to adjust lighting, how to do different frame rates with video. Whatever the specification is that's out there, there are a variety of options. Whether to use flash, your built-in phone flash or external lighting. All of these things are out there, and if you take the time to learn how to use them, you'll end up with much better mobile device photos that will certainly could rival your DSLR photos without a doubt. But for those people who don't know what all the little menu items are and all the little options you have, you might be disappointed in the images you get from the phone.
Yeah. Do you see a time in the future where, you could see somebody like a crime scene investigator or something just, doing the majority of their work on, on their phone?
I do. And when Larry and I used to do the classes many years ago, I used to say that. I said, there will be a time, I would say this to the audience, probably at the end of your careers, or at least certainly within your careers, where you could stand at the threshold of a room, if that room is a crime scene, or the edge of a road for a crash scene, and simply paint, wand your phone around that area, just, shoot, and record everything with three-dimensional accuracy, three-dimensional views, high accuracy, and be able to use that for further analysis. I think that time will be here. There are some hurdles to overcome, these agency issues, the standard operating procedures, all of the never-ending worry about accreditation and minimum standards and federal standards and all of these things. Again, I think they'll all be overcome in time. They may seem insurmountable now, but I think it'll happen.
Okay. Yeah. Donna's saying we've talked about it for the last 10 plus years. Yeah. And we probably might be another 10 plus years before it might be another 10 years before things start to change. We'll see. Well, I think it might be. I know that there are agencies now that are issuing better phones out to people. Oftentimes, agencies are giving people cheap phones, right? They're not giving their
Right.
CSI people. But I have seen a trend more recently where people in the crime scene investigation, or people that the investigators, they're getting some upgraded equipment. So they're either getting like an upgraded iPad, or they're getting better phones with some more capabilities with the different sensors like the LiDAR, and they're making an investment in some different apps, or at the very least, I know there's many agencies that are testing at least different apps that could be used, which is good. That's a good sign. Maybe that means that there's more things to come.
Right. And with that, the administrative side has to keep up. and this is another big problem in public safety agencies, not so much on the private side, although private practitioners having some type of policy statement might be good to have, that they could have in writing in case it's needed for testimony, just to show they're following their company's policy. But on the public safety side, it's really critical to update standard operating procedures, administrative orders, whatever they're called in whatever agency it is, to keep up with this digital world. I have run into public safety agencies that haven't updated their photography SOPs since the 1970s. And when you look at their SOPs, they're talking about the crime scene investigator. Back then, they were in a lot of departments called ID techs, identification technicians. It would talk about the ID tech turning in their rolls of film to the evidence bureau at the end of their shift, and then the evidence bureau having to process those rolls of film within a certain amount of time, and then putting the negatives in one locker and producing two sets of prints, one that goes to another locker and one that goes back to a detective. I mean, on and on about the film days. They've never rewritten their SOPs. And this is very important, because if a current law enforcement officer or employee is testifying, and the defense attorney comes up and says, show me in your SOP where you handle the digital images the way you just testified that you handled them, they're not going to be able to find it, because their SOP is going to talk about film. And that's not going to look good on the stand. And it can be exploited, very, very heavily exploited by a defense attorney who could bring out in open court, you're not following your SOPs, are you? Because there is no SOP on this. It could, it might be minor in some instances, it might be major in another, but it's always a little bit embarrassing where the administrative side doesn't keep up with the worker bee side. So I can't emphasize that enough. And that was really one of the things that Larry Stringham taught me. He encountered that being an agency employee and an agency supervisor. He encountered that where I didn't, where he said, you have to keep up with the SOPs. Everybody needs to be on board as to how to handle all this technology and not leave it open-ended.
Yeah, and you brought up another point, and you touched on it, but I'll expand on it, and that is that people in policing these days are being asked to do a lot, in some cases too much. Mm-hmm. And so simplicity is key. And so if an app makes things simpler and streamlined and it's integrated into a system, that means that they don't have to get like massive training on, something different or a whole huge massive system. Because I mean, some of my police colleagues, DNA, biology, chemistry stuff, the trajectory stuff, the bloodstain stuff. Right. And it's like, I tell them sometimes, how do you keep track of all this?
Crime scene technicians these days, and I've said this many times, I believe this is the most diversified profession on the planet right now because of what you just said. The crime scene investigator, a little more than a traffic crash investigator, but the crime scene people have to either be experts at, or at least be very familiar and fluent with all of the things you mentioned and a whole bunch more. There's no other profession out there that has so many diverse elements to it. You could be an expert at blood spatter. Are you also going to be an expert at ballistics? Are you also going to be an expert at time distance analysis for a traffic homicide? Are you also going to be a great photographer? Can you make maps? Are you a cartographer? Are you a surveyor? So many things come into this, and it covers a long range of time too. From the time a CSI goes out to that forest, like Larry was mentioning, to document evidence, to the time it goes to trial, could be 2 or 3 years down the road, maybe more. So you have a lot of things to do, a lot of things to remember. The documentation effort has to be really tight so that you can remember all these details. I don't know of any other profession on the planet that has that type of burden placed upon the shoulders of the practitioners.
Yeah, no, definitely. I've seen it day in and day out. So yeah, my kudos to them for holding it all together.
Yeah.
What about you? So, I mean, you're doing a ton of stuff now. What is next on the horizon for you?
Well, the latest technological thing that I've been involved with for a few years is the cell phone mapping. And I think that's just going to be almost a full-time job here soon because, at least in Florida, where I'm at, the state attorney's offices are pulling the cell phone records from every arrestee. And sometimes they use them and sometimes they don't. But if they are used as a basis of location as to where a suspect, a defendant may have been prior to a crime or after a crime, they're using the cell phone information for that, the tower information. Now, what I'm talking about are the records from the phone company. Those are called CDRs, or call detail records, not to be confused with CDR, crash data recorders, which is also talked about in the industry. So the records from the phone company show the towers that were being used by all the calls, and therefore places a person in a particular neighborhood. It doesn't identify the exact address they were on. It just shows they were in an area. This is different from what's downloaded from the phone, which is called a forensic extraction. So I'm not talking about that type of task at all. What I get involved with mostly are these phone records to show where people were and the time where when they were at a certain location in relation to a crime scene. So that's where I think the next big thing is. It's continuing from where it's already started.
That's excellent. Well, look, Robert, I want to say thank you so much. Thank you for being, just so enthusiastic about technology and everything else, and for all your hard work, because I saw you at Rex, man. You were working hard. So you were sweating down there, running around, taking photos. I mean, you help out at conferences, you help out everywhere. And yeah, so thank you so much for your commitment to all these different places and everything else. It's truly appreciated.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the recognition. I absolutely appreciate meeting you finally in person after so many years of talking about photogrammetry and other things. And then just looking at the comments on the side of my screen here, so many of my friends and colleagues have watched this. I really appreciate their time today. It means a great deal to me. And thanks for having me. Thank you very
Excellent.
much for the whole thing.
We shall be in touch. So, hey, hang back here. I'm just going to make some closing comments.
Okay.
All right. Cheers. All right, folks, that does it for this one. Back in full swing. We're going to have a few more guests coming up in the very near future. Got some really interesting presentations and that sort of thing coming up too. Again, thank you so much for the comments. Great interaction today. Lots of good questions. And hey, I wish you all the best. Have a happy Thursday, and we shall see you very soon. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.